In the year 1000, give or take a summer, a woman named Gudrun Osvifersdottir sat across from a man named Gestur and asked him a question about her marriage. Not whether she should save it, whether she could end it. Gestur told her about a provision in Icelandic law so specific it sounds invented. If a husband wore a shirt with a neckline cut low enough to expose his chest, his wife could declare the marriage dissolved. Gudrun went home. She made her husband Thorvaldr a new shirt, wide-necked, generously cut. Then she named her witnesses, stated her grounds, and walked out of the marriage carrying her dowry, her mourning gift, and her reputation. She remarried. She remarried again after that. The Laxdæla saga, written 2.5 centuries later, tells this story not as scandal, but as cleverness. A woman who knew the law and used it. You have probably never heard of Gudrun Osvifersdottir, but you know the system that replaced hers. If you are an American adult who has been through a divorce or watched someone go through one, you know the weight of it. The attorneys, the mandatory waiting periods, the filing fees and discovery motions and custody evaluations, and the particular fluorescent misery of sitting in a conference room while 2 lawyers negotiate the value of a kitchen table. The median cost of a divorce in the United States is around $7,000. Contested divorces with children and significant assets run far higher, $15,000, $20,000, $30,000. The process takes months at minimum. In many states, a year or more. In California, you cannot finalize a divorce in less than 6 months, regardless of whether both parties agree on everything. 1,000 years ago, in Iceland, the legal declaration that ended a marriage took minutes, not 30 seconds. That number circulates online, and it flatters the Viking Age into a meme. The real process required assembling witnesses. The Gragas, Iceland's medieval law code, specified how many, and making a formal public declaration of divorce, what the law called skilnaður. In a dispersed farming society, where your nearest neighbor might live a hard ride away, gathering those witnesses could take days. And the aftermath? Dividing livestock, negotiating who kept the farm, managing the social reverberations between 2 families whose alliance had just dissolved. That took longer still. But the legal mechanism itself was simple. Either spouse could initiate it. No court to petition, no judge to convince, no waiting period mandated by statute, no requirement to prove fault, though grounds could be stated. And here is the part that should stop you. Either spouse. A Norse woman in the 10th century could end her own marriage. English women did not obtain that right on equal legal footing until 1923. Let that gap sit for a moment. 900 years. To understand why Viking divorce worked the way it did, you have to understand what Viking marriage was, and what it was not. It was not a sacrament. There was no priest, no church, no theology of 2 souls fused into one indissoluble union by divine authority. Marriage in Norse society was a contract between families, a deal. And like any deal, it had terms, and those terms included what happened when the deal ended. 3 financial instruments governed every Norse marriage. The mundur, a bride price paid by the groom's family to the bride's family, negotiated in advance, often in silver or livestock. The heimanfylgja, the dowry the bride brought from her own family into the marriage. And the morgungifu, the morning gift, presented by the husband to the wife after the wedding night. These were not romantic gestures. They were legally binding property transfers, witnessed and recorded in the memories of the men who attended the wedding feast. And they determined, with considerable precision, what each party walked away with if the marriage dissolved. A divorced woman reclaimed her dowry and her mourning gift. Those were hers, not her husband's, not the community's. Hers. In a subsistence farming society where a good dowry might include jewelry, woven textiles, livestock, and sometimes land use rights, this was not a symbolic gesture. A divorced woman with a substantial dowry was not ruined. She was, in many cases, a highly attractive prospect for remarriage. Divorce could increase a woman's economic standing, not diminish it. You are probably thinking this sounds too good, too clean, too modern. It was not modern, and it was not clean. Norse society was an honor culture of extraordinary intensity. Reputation was survival, and divorce, however legally simple, was socially explosive. Consider the cross-dressing provision that Gudrun exploited. A wife could divorce her husband if he wore effeminate clothing. A husband could divorce his wife if she wore masculine clothing, specifically breeches. These sound absurd to a modern ear. They were not absurd in a culture where gender performance was so tightly policed that calling a man argr, unmanly, was one of 3 insults for which you could legally kill the person who said it. A divorce that implied a man was sexually inadequate or a woman was stepping outside her gender role carried reputational damage that could ripple through a community for years. The Gragas was procedurally efficient. Norse society was not emotionally efficient. The saga literature is full of divorces that triggered feuds, retaliatory killings, and multi-generational grudges. Legally simple and socially dangerous, 2 things you probably assume cannot coexist. They coexisted constantly. Custody, too, was more complicated than popular accounts suggest. The widespread claim that women automatically retained custody of their children is not well supported by the Gragas. The law code's provisions on children after divorce are detailed, variable, and pragmatic rather than sentimental. Children generally went with the parent who could better support them economically. In a society where farms and productive land were predominantly controlled by men, that often meant the father's household. The law was not matriarchal. It was contractual, and contracts favor the party with more assets. So, strip away the romanticism. What remains? What remains is still remarkable. A legal system, oral and customary, administered at open-air assemblies under the sky, that gave both parties in a marriage the right to dissolve it. That anticipated divorce as a normal life event and legislated for it in granular detail, down to how household goods and livestock should be divided, down to what clothing counted as grounds. That allowed women a degree of legal agency in marital dissolution that would not be matched in most of Western Europe for nearly a millennium. The Gragas survives in 2 vellum manuscripts copied in the 1260s, now held at the Arni Magnusson Institute in Reykjavik. Brown ink on calfskin. The handwriting is compressed, pragmatic, the work of scribes recording what law speakers had memorized and recited aloud at the Altingi for generations. These manuscripts are the physical evidence that a small island in the North Atlantic, settled barely 3 centuries earlier by Norse farmers and their Celtic thralls, had developed a legal culture sophisticated enough to handle the dissolution of marriage with more procedural clarity than most modern jurisdictions manage today. But then something changed, and what changed was religion. Norse paganism was decentralized, flexible, and largely unconcerned with regulating marriage as a spiritual matter. Odin did not ordain matrimony. Thor did not bless unions. Marriage was a human contract managed by human law. When Christianity arrived in Scandinavia, gradually, politically, sometimes violently, it brought with it a theology that redefined marriage entirely. Marriage became a sacrament, a bond created by God. indissoluble except by death, and even then only reluctantly. Iceland converted to Christianity at the Alþingi in the year 1000, in a negotiated political compromise designed to prevent civil war. The law speaker, Þorgeir Ljósvetningagodi, himself a pagan, ruled that Iceland would adopt Christianity as its official religion while permitting private pagan practice to continue. It was a remarkable act of political pragmatism, but the long-term legal consequences for women were severe. As canon law gradually displaced customary law across Scandinavia over the following 2 centuries, women's right to initiate divorce eroded, then vanished. The Church did not bring civilization to Norse divorce law. It took something away. Christianity did not introduce moral seriousness to Scandinavian marriage. Norse marriage was already serious, deadly serious, governed by honor, enforced by the threat of feud. What Christianity introduced was institutional control. A marriage that had been a private contract between families, dissolvable by the parties themselves, became a public sacrament administered by a church, dissolvable only by ecclesiastical authority, and in practice almost never dissolved at all. The theological position that what God had joined, no human could put asunder, became the legal reality for European women for the next 800 years. This is not an argument that the Norse were more enlightened. They were not. They were a society that enslaved roughly 10% of Iceland's founding population, that raided monasteries for profit, that policed gender boundaries with lethal seriousness. The ease of their divorce law did not spring from progressive ideology. It sprang from the structural fact that no centralized religious institution had claimed authority over marriage. When one did, the rights disappeared. The modern divorce system, the one with attorneys and filing fees and mandatory waiting periods, is the direct descendant of that theological intervention. The common law tradition in England, which shaped American family law, inherited the canonical principle that marriage was not a contract, but a sacrament. No-fault divorce did not arrive in any American state until California adopted it in 1969. For centuries before that, you had to prove wrongdoing, adultery, cruelty, abandonment to obtain a divorce. And proving wrongdoing required lawyers, courts, evidence, and time. The machinery we built around ending a marriage was not inevitable. It was theological. We chose it. Or rather, it was chosen for us 1,000 years ago when a law speaker on a volcanic plain made a political calculation about which god to follow. Here is where the story rhymes across a millennium. Denmark today processes uncontested divorces with no minor children through an online administrative system. No court appearance, minimal fee, weeks, not months. Sweden is similarly streamlined. Norway likewise. The modern descendants of the Vikings still divorce more easily than almost anyone else in the Western world. This is not a direct legal inheritance. Modern Scandinavian family law is a product of 20th century social democratic reform, not a survival of the Gragas. But the cultural instinct persists. The assumption that a marriage is a relationship between two people, not a covenant between two people and the state, runs deep in societies that spent their formative centuries treating marriage as exactly that, a contract, with an exit clause. The American system costs more to end a marriage than a Norse farmer spent to start one. The Mundur was, the bride price, might be a few ounces of silver or a handful of livestock. A modern American contested divorce can exceed the median annual income. There is a popular account, you have probably seen it, that says a Viking who wanted to divorce walked to the doorway, declared the divorce, walked to the marriage bed, declared it again, walked to the main entrance of the longhouse, declared it a third time, And it was done. 3 declarations, 3 locations, 30 seconds. It makes for a perfect social media post. The problem is that this specific formula does not appear in the Gragas. It does not appear in any saga passage that scholars have been able to confidently identify. It may be a conflation with Islamic talaq practices. It may derive from a secondary source that has been copied so many times it has acquired the authority of primary evidence. The honest answer is that we do not know where it comes from, and historians of Old Norse law have not verified it. The truth is less cinematic and more interesting. The Gragas required a public declaration before a specified number of witnesses. The grounds were stated. The property consequences followed from the marriage contract. The process was fast by any modern standard. But it was a legal act, not a dramatic performance. It required preparation, not spontaneity. Norse law was precise, procedural, and deeply concerned with getting the details right. These were people who memorized entire legal codes and recited them from memory at annual assemblies. They did not do anything in 30 seconds. What they did with a clarity that the modern world has buried under centuries of accumulated procedure. A marriage was a contract. Either party could end it. The property division was predetermined by the contract's own terms. The declaration was public, witnessed, and binding. No intermediary institution, no church, no court, no state stood between the parties and their decision. If you have Norse ancestry or Scandinavian ancestry, or if you simply live in a common law country whose legal traditions were shaped by the same medieval church that displaced Norse marital law, you are living inside the consequences of this history. The system that replaced the Gragas is the system you inherited, the mandatory waiting period, the fault-based presumptions that linger even in no-fault jurisdictions, the assumption that ending a marriage requires institutional permission, and the keys. Think about the keys. A Norse husfreyja, the lady of the household, wore the household keys at her belt. They were her symbol of domestic authority. When she left, she took them, or she surrendered them. The keys were real. Iron, heavy, worn every day. They unlocked the storerooms, the chests, the provisions that kept a family alive through a North Atlantic winter. When a woman reclaimed those keys after a divorce or handed them over, the gesture carried the weight of an entire household's survival. The next time you sign a divorce decree or watch someone you love sign one in a fluorescent-lit office after months of negotiation and thousands of dollars in fees, think about those iron keys. Think about a woman on a volcanic island, 1,000 years ago, who named her witnesses, stated her grounds, and walked out the carved wooden doorway of a longhouse carrying everything that was hers. The doorway was low. Most adults had to duck. She would have bent her head as she stepped through. Then she stood up straight on the other side.